Everyone keeps asking me the wrong question. They want to know whether the Strait of Hormuz stays open, whether the bombing campaign achieves its objectives, whether Iran's military can sustain the pressure. Those are fine questions. Military analysts are answering them across every platform that will have them. But there is a different question, a quieter one, and no one in the mainstream financial press has asked it clearly enough to be useful. Here it is. What happens to the instrument that gives the United States its actual power when the country it has been punishing for 40 years turns out to have already built the exit? Because that is what is happening right now. Not in the Strait, not in the missile exchanges, in the payment systems, in the currency settlement networks, in the fact that a senior Iranian official told CNN in the middle of a shooting war that tankers could pass through the world's most critical energy choke point, conditionally. The condition? Pay in yuan. That sentence, 4 words really, is the most consequential financial event of 2026. And I want to explain exactly why, with the numbers that make the argument impossible to dismiss. By the time I'm done, you will understand something that 3 hours of cable news coverage this week did not give you. You will understand why the war in Iran is not primarily a military story. It is a stress test, and the system being stress tested is not Iran's. It's ours. Let me start with the plumbing, because the plumbing is where the argument lives. The petrodollar system was born in the summer of 1974. Nixon had just blown up the gold standard 3 years earlier. The dollar was no longer backed by anything physical, and Washington needed a new reason for the world to keep holding and demanding American currency. The solution was crude oil. In June 1974, the United States and Saudi Arabia formalized an arrangement. Saudi oil, and eventually all OPEC oil, would be priced and settled in US dollars. In exchange, Washington would provide military protection and arms. Every country on earth that needed oil, which was every country on earth, would first need to acquire dollars. Global demand for the dollar became structurally guaranteed by the most traded commodity in human history. That arrangement lasted 52 years. In June 2024, Saudi Arabia chose not to renew it. Riyadh signaled openness to accepting yuan, euros, Japanese yen, and Indian rupees for crude sales. The skeptics said it wouldn't matter. Dollar infrastructure was too deep, too habitual, too entrenched. Those skeptics were partially right, until the war. Now here is what 52 years of petrodollar dominance actually produced for the United States. The dollar comprised 58% of disclosed global official foreign reserves in 2024. That is the reserve currency position. But the more important number is this. The dollar was bought or sold in approximately 88% of global foreign exchange transactions. 88%. That means when a Japanese company buys Brazilian iron ore, they typically route the transaction through dollars. When a Korean refinery buys UAE crude, dollars. When a German bank finances a Singaporean shipping contract, dollars. The dollar is not just America's currency, it is the world's transaction layer. And the transaction layer is where sanctions enforcement lives. This is the mechanism people miss when they talk about sanctions. The United States does not enforce sanctions by deploying ships or inspectors. It enforces sanctions by controlling the rails. If your transaction passes through a U.S. correspondent bank, and 88% of global foreign exchange transactions touch the U.S. system in some form, Washington can see it, freeze it, or block it. That is American financial power in its operational form, not the military, the payment rails. Iran has been cut off from those rails for over 4 decades, and that is where this story starts to become genuinely interesting. Here is what the mainstream analysis has consistently underestimated. Being locked out of the dollar system for 40 years does not just hurt a country, it teaches a country. And what Iran learned, or more precisely what China learned by helping Iran, is that the dollar system has a specific vulnerability. It requires participation. The moment you build an alternative that functions without dollar participation, the enforcement mechanism has a hole in it. China's cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, provides a payment channel that allows banks to settle transactions without routing money through the U.S. banking system. A transaction settled through CIPS between a Chinese and Iranian bank never touches a U.S. correspondent bank, which is precisely where sanctions enforcement enters the picture. The dollar doesn't move. A U.S. institution is never involved. The transaction happens entirely within China's financial system, and Iranian banks receive yuan they can then use to purchase Chinese goods, machinery, or equipment outside the reach of U.S. Treasury enforcement entirely. CIPS processed the equivalent of $245 trillion in yuan-denominated transactions in 2025 alone, a 43% increase from the year before. $245 trillion. Let that sit for a moment. That is not a pilot program. That is not a proof of concept. That is an operational alternative payment architecture growing at 43% per year, processing transactions that the U.S. Treasury cannot intercept, freeze, or monitor in any meaningful way. I have watched central bank payment infrastructure evolve for 4 decades. The growth rate of CIPS over the past 3 years is not normal. It is the growth rate of a system that is absorbing real demand, demand that would have gone through dollar channels a decade ago and is now being rerouted. And Iran is where the rerouting was stress tested first. China was the dominant buyer of Iranian seaborne oil in 2025, purchasing roughly 1.38 million barrels per day, more than 80% of Iran's total exports, with yuan-denominated payments, shadow shipping arrangements, and intermediary networks deployed to blunt U.S. sanctions at every step. 1.38 million barrels per day, settled outside the dollar, despite maximum pressure, despite OFAC designations, despite secondary sanctions, despite every enforcement tool the U.S. Treasury has deployed over 4 decades. The sanctions didn't stop the oil. They routed the oil through a system that now processes $245 trillion a year in dollar-independent transactions. And that system is what Iran just proposed to attach to the world's most critical energy choke point. Now I want to show you the layer that the financial coverage has almost entirely missed. De-dollarization has been discussed in financial circles for years. The YouTube commentators have covered it. The gold community has covered it. The BRICS watchers have covered it. And the mainstream response has consistently been, the dollar is still dominant. The yuan is not convertible. There is no viable alternative. The dollar will be fine. That response is not wrong about the current state. The dollar remains by far the dominant reserve currency. The yuan has deep structural limitations as a replacement. It is not freely tradable. China's capital account is closed, and the depth of U.S. financial markets has no peer. Hung Tran, a former deputy director at the IMF and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, has argued carefully that while a gradual democratization of the global financial landscape may be underway, the dollar will retain its dominant position in the foreseeable future. He is probably right about the long-term trajectory. He is almost certainly right that the dollar will not collapse next Tuesday. But the mainstream analysis is asking the wrong question. The question is not whether de-dollarization replaces the dollar. The question is whether de-dollarization erodes the dollar's enforcement utility. Those are very different animals. Here is the distinction in plain terms. If the dollar's share of global reserves falls from 72% to 58%, which it already has from 2001 to 2024, American borrowing costs do not immediately spike. American purchasing power does not immediately collapse. But Washington's ability to impose effective financial sanctions on countries that have built dollar-independent payment infrastructure, that erodes in direct proportion to the scale of the infrastructure bypassing it. SIPs at $245 trillion per year is not a replacement for the dollar. It is a bypass. And bypasses don't need to carry all the traffic to be strategically decisive. They need to carry enough traffic that the countries the U.S. wants to sanction can route their most critical transactions around the enforcement mechanism. Iran has been the test case for 40 years. Western officials have estimated that roughly $8.4 billion in oil payments flowed through China's alternative payment networks for Iranian oil in 2024 alone, financing airports, refineries, and transportation networks inside the country. $8.4 billion through channels the U.S. Treasury cannot touch in a single year, under what was supposed to be maximum pressure. The sanctions did not fail because they were poorly designed. They failed, partially, meaningfully, because the infrastructure to route around them had been quietly built. And that infrastructure was built in significant part using Iran as the test case, because Iran had no choice but to figure it out. Now, Iran has taken that test case and proposed to attach it to 20 million barrels of daily oil transit. That is not a rhetorical move. That is the moment the experiment graduates from a sanctions evasion tool to a structural challenge to the petrodollar system itself. There is a story inside this story that almost no one is talking about, and it is the one that matters most for the next 5 to 10 years. Project mBridge, a multi-currency digital payment platform involving China, Hong Kong, Thailand, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, surged past $55 billion in transaction volume by early 2026, with China's digital yuan dominating settlements. The system enables near-instant, low-cost cross-border payments on a shared ledger that no U.S. institution touches, that no SWIFT message traverses, and that no U.S. correspondent bank intermediates. $55 billion in volume. Saudi Arabia is a participant. The UAE is a participant. These are the countries that sit inside the Persian Gulf, the countries whose oil has to transit the Strait of Hormuz to reach the rest of the world. They are also the countries that for 52 years recycled their oil revenues into U.S. Treasury securities as the structural anchor of the entire petrodollar system. Iran's yuan condition at Hormuz is not Iran operating alone. What makes it structurally significant is not simply that it challenges the dollar. That rhetoric has circulated for years without materializing into meaningful change. What is different here is the mechanism. Tehran is not merely proposing that some bilateral trade occur in yuan. It is proposing that access to the world's most critical energy choke point be conditional on currency denomination. The practical consequence, if even partially adopted, is a bifurcated global oil market. Yuan-denominated barrels for those willing to settle in China's currency, dollar-denominated barrels rerouted at significant additional cost and time for those who are not. The war premium that Western energy importers are already absorbing above $100 a barrel would become structural rather than temporary. Here is the point that keeps me up at night, professionally speaking. The petrodollar was born in a crisis. 1973, oil embargo. Nixon had just killed the gold standard and needed a new anchor for the dollar. Henry Kissinger flew to Riyadh, and in June 1974, the arrangement was formalized. The dollar got its structural global demand guarantee. The crisis created the system. What we are watching in real time, in the middle of this shooting war at $100 oil with 20 million barrels of daily transit held conditionally, is another crisis. And crises are when financial architecture gets rewritten, not gradually, fast. I want to step back from the data for a moment. I have spent 40 years watching governments use financial systems as weapons. I watched the U.S. apply sanctions to Iran in 1979, tighten them through the 1990s, and ratchet them to maximum pressure over the past decade. I watched those sanctions cause genuine economic damage, inflation, currency collapse, shortages. I also watched them fail to change Iranian strategic behavior in any fundamental way. And I watched, with considerable professional interest, as the payment architecture designed to route around those sanctions grew from a workaround into something that now processes $245 trillion a year. The lesson I draw from 40 years of watching this is not that sanctions don't work. They work within limits. The lesson is that when you weaponize a financial system aggressively enough, for long enough, against enough countries, you incentivize the construction of an alternative. You do the work of your adversaries for them. You make the case to every neutral country watching, India, Brazil, Turkey, the Gulf states, that the risk of dollar dependency is real and worth hedging against. The United States has been making that case loudly for 4 decades, and the alternative is now operational. I have rarely been more certain about where this leads, not to the dollar's collapse, but to something more subtle and in some ways more damaging. A world in which the dollar remains the largest single currency, but is no longer the universal default. A world in which the enforcement utility of financial sanctions erodes in proportion to the infrastructure that bypasses them. A world in which the next time Washington wants to apply maximum pressure to a country that matters strategically, it finds that maximum pressure produces less pressure than it used to. That is the world Iran just helped build, not with missiles, with 40 years of being forced to find a different way. Everyone is watching the Strait of Hormuz. The story that actually matters is this. Iran didn't just survive de-dollarization. Iran is the country that proved it was survivable, and in the process showed China exactly what to build. The petrodollar was born from an oil crisis in 1974. It may now be unraveling in one in 2026. The question is not whether the dollar survives. It will. The question is, how much does the ability to sanction cost when the countries you want to sanction can settle in yuan and you cannot stop them?